In 1887, the town burned to the ground, and everyone agreed it was an accident. A stove left unattended, a gust of wind, bad luck stacked on bad timing. That story had been told so many times, it settled into the soil like truth. But inside a weather-beaten house at the edge of the hills, an old man sat awake before dawn, knowing that lies can age, but they do not rot. They harden. Elias Crowley had not spoken about that night in 40 years. Not to neighbors, not to preachers, not even to himself, not honestly. Silence had become a habit, then a shield, then a prison he no longer remembered choosing. His house stood alone, far from the rebuilt streets and fresh paint of a town that pretended it had been reborn clean. The boards creaked with every shift of his weight, as if the house itself remembered things Elias tried not to. When the knock came, it was careful. Not the sharp sound of authority, not the nervous tapping of a boy. It was patient, respectful, the kind of knock that assumed it would eventually be answered. Elias did not move. He sat at the small table near the window, hands folded, eyes fixed on a thin line of morning light cutting across the floor. He had known this moment would come one day. Not the knock itself, but the reckoning behind it. Truth has a way of walking long roads. The man outside waited, then spoke through the door. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "Mr. Crowley, my name is Thomas Hale. I'm a journalist from back east. I won't take much of your time." Journalist. The word stirred something bitter. Elias had seen men like that before, back when the ashes were still warm. They came with notebooks and clean collars, asking careful questions and leaving with half answers. Most of them stopped coming when the town decided forgetting was easier than knowing. "I was told you were there," the man continued. "The night of the fire." Elias closed his eyes. He could still smell it when he let himself remember. Not the flames, but the fear. Fear has a scent, sharp and unmistakable. He rose slowly and crossed the room. The door groaned as he opened it just enough to look out. The journalist stood alone, hat in his hands, coat neatly buttoned. His boots were dusty, but not worn down by the years. He looked like someone who still believed that truth, once spoken, naturally led to justice. "You should leave," Elias said. His voice surprised him. It was rough, but steady. "There's nothing here for you." The journalist did not step back. He did not step forward either. "People say you stopped talking after the fire," he said. "They say you saw something. People say a lot of things." Elias had spent decades letting rumors take the place of facts, because rumors never ask to be proven. "I saw a town burn," Elias replied, "same as everyone else." The journalist nodded, as if he expected that answer. "Officially, yes," he said, "but official stories don't always tell the whole thing." That was the danger of polite men. They didn't threaten. They invited. They made it sound like a favor. Elias looked past him, toward the distant rooftops catching the early sun. New buildings stood where old lives once had. Children played in streets that had been paved over memory. The men who made decisions back then still had names carved into plaques and offices with clean windows. "You don't understand," Elias said quietly. "Some truths don't stay put once you let them out." The journalist hesitated for the first time. "And some don't let go until you do," he said. Silence stretched between them. Elias felt the old pull inside his chest, the same one that had kept him awake night after night. Part of him wanted to shut the door and return to the quiet he had earned through endurance. Another part, smaller but sharper, wondered how much longer a man could carry a thing before it carried him instead. Finally, Elias opened the door wider. Not in welcome, in surrender. "You get 1 hour," he said. "After that, you leave." The journalist stepped inside, gratitude flickering across his face. He did not yet know what it would cost to hear the rest. Elias did, and as the door closed behind them, the old man understood that silence, once broken, does not come back the same. Before the fire, Elias Crowley lived a life so ordinary that it barely left a mark on the days. That was the part that hurt the most when he looked back on it later. Not that it was grand or important, but that it was steady, predictable, safe in ways he did not recognize until it was gone. He had a small house near the center of town then, close enough to hear the church bell and the wagons rolling by each morning. The paint was faded, and the roof leaked when the rain came hard, but it was his. He shared it with his wife, Margaret, and their young son, Samuel. Evenings were quiet, supper at the same hour, lamps lit just as the sun dropped behind the hills. Laughter came easily back then, without effort or caution. Elias worked as a clerk for the grain company. It was not a job that earned respect, but it earned bread. He knew the weight of sacks, the sound of ledgers closing, the rhythm of honest work. The men he worked for wore clean coats and spoke kindly in public. They shook hands in daylight and made decisions behind closed doors. Elias did not think much about them. He had no reason to. On Sundays, Margaret braided her hair and held Samuel's hand as they walked to church. Elias followed a step behind, listening to his son ask questions about everything he saw. The town felt permanent then, like something that had always been there and always would be. People argued, people gossiped, but no one imagined the ground beneath them could vanish overnight. The night of the fire began like any other. Supper dishes were still on the table. Samuel had fallen asleep early, worn out from running with other boys near the river. Margaret hummed softly while folding clothes. Elias sat by the window, reading by lamplight, thinking about nothing that mattered. Then came the smell. At first, Elias thought it was a neighbor's stove burning too hot. That happened sometimes, but the air grew thick too fast, sharp and wrong. He stood and opened the door, and the night rushed in carrying panic with it. Down the street, an orange glow climbed the sky. Shouts followed, then screams. Margaret grabbed Samuel, fear already in her eyes. "Elias," she said, and that was all she needed to say. They stepped outside into chaos. People ran past them, some carrying children, some carrying nothing at all. Sparks drifted through the air like falling stars. The fire moved with purpose, jumping from roof to roof as if it knew where to go. Elias tried to lead his family toward the river, but the street was blocked by fallen beams and smoke so thick it burned his eyes. Somewhere nearby, a building collapsed with a sound like thunder. Samuel cried, clinging to his mother's neck. Elias felt the weight of every choice pressing down on him at once. Then he saw something he was never meant to see. Near the grain office, where the fire burned hottest, a group of men stood together. Not running, not shouting. They were calm. One of them held a lantern, shielding the flame from the wind. Elias recognized their coats, their hats, the way they carried themselves. These were not men caught by surprise. One of them noticed Elias watching. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that look Elias understood that this fire was not a mistake. It was a decision. A hand grabbed Elias's arm and pulled him away. "Move!" someone shouted. "If you want to live, move now!" He did. He ran. He did not look back again. By morning, the town was gone. Smoke drifted over blackened ground where homes and shops had stood. People searched the ruins in silence, calling names that would never be answered. Elias held his family close, telling himself that survival should be enough. But as the sun rose over the ashes, he knew something inside him had already been destroyed. The peace he had lived in, the trust he never questioned, the belief that some lines would never be crossed. All of it was gone. And standing among the ruins, Elias understood that the fire had not just taken the town. It had taken the man he used to be. Silence did not come naturally to Elias Crowley. It had to be learned, practiced, and reinforced every day like a habit that kept him alive. After the fire, the town spoke in low voices for a while, then not at all. Questions faded. Blame settled nowhere. Official men arrived, took notes, nodded, and left. The word accident was repeated until it felt solid enough to stand on. Elias tried to follow along. He rebuilt what he could. He returned to work when the grain company reopened under a new sign, owned by the same hands. He kept his head down and his answers short. At night, he told himself that surviving was proof he had done the right thing. Then the message came. It was delivered without threat, without raised voices. That was the cruelest part. One afternoon, Elias was called into a back office he had never been invited into before. The men inside greeted him kindly. They offered him a chair. One even poured him a glass of water, as if this were a friendly talk between neighbors. They spoke plainly. They knew Elias had been near the grain office the night of the fire. They knew what he had seen, and they knew where his wife and son slept every night. "No one wants trouble," one of them said, smiling gently. "This town needs peace to grow again." Another leaned forward. "You seem like a family man. We respect that." They did not threaten him. They did not need to. They explained consequences the way one might explain weather. Unpleasant, unavoidable, and not their fault. Elias left that office feeling smaller than he ever had before. By the time he reached home, his hands were shaking. Margaret noticed at once. She always did. "What happened?" she asked. Elias looked at his wife, at his son playing on the floor, unaware of how fragile the world truly was. He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to say the words out loud and feel them become real. Instead, he said, "Nothing. Just work." That night, he did not sleep. Days passed, then weeks. The town settled into a routine that pretended nothing had been wrong. Elias learned how to answer questions without answering them. When people whispered, he stayed quiet. When officials spoke, he nodded. But silence has a cost. It asks for payment in small pieces at first. The emotional turn came quietly, on a night that should have been ordinary. Samuel woke from a dream and asked his father why their old house was gone. Elias tried to explain, choosing careful words. Accident, fire, bad luck. Samuel listened, then frowned. "But you don't believe that," he said. Elias froze. "Why would you say that?" "Because you get quiet when you say it," Samuel replied. The honesty of a child cut deeper than any threat. Elias realized then that his silence was no longer just his burden. It was shaping his son, teaching him that fear was something to live with, not fight. For the first time since the fire, Elias considered speaking out anyway. He imagined standing in the town square, telling the truth, letting the weight fall where it may. He imagined the relief of it. Then he imagined Margaret alone, Samuel growing up without him, the future collapsing the same way the town had. That was the choice. Not between right and wrong, but between two kinds of loss. A week later, a folded note appeared on their table while Elias was at work. No name, no greeting. Just a reminder of addresses, routines, and times. Proof that the watching had never stopped. Margaret found it. She waited until evening to ask about it. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were not. Elias tried to deny it at first. Then he tried to soften it. Finally, the truth came out in pieces. When he finished, Margaret sat in silence for a long time. "So that's it," she said at last. "We live with a lie so we can live it all." Elias wanted her to be angry. He wanted shouting, blame, something that felt honest. Instead, she reached for his hand. "We protect our family," she said. "That's what matters." Her forgiveness hurt more than anger would have. It sealed the choice. From that day on, Elias became the man everyone expected him to be. Quiet, agreeable, forgettable. He watched as the men responsible gained influence and respect. He listened as the story hardened into history. But at night, when the house was still, he replayed that moment near the grain office. The calm faces, the knowing eyes. He told himself he had chosen love over truth. What he did not admit, not yet, was how easily love had been turned into a leash. Years passed, and the town did more than rebuild. It prospered. New storefronts lined the streets, painted bright and clean. Names were carved into stone above banks and offices, honoring men praised for leadership and vision. Elias Crowley watched it all from a distance, a quiet figure everyone recognized, but few truly saw. He had grown old without meaning to. His hair thinned, his back bent, and his hands stiffened from work that never led anywhere. Margaret passed away during a mild winter, her absence leaving the house too quiet to ignore. Samuel grew up and left town, carrying questions Elias never answered. The family he had stayed silent to protect slowly became memories. That was when the waiting ended. The journalist returned, older now, less hopeful in his eyes, but sharper in his questions. He did not come chasing rumors. He came with names, dates, and records that hinted at what Elias had known all along. The men who stood calm during the fire were no longer hiding. They were respected leaders. Their signatures were on town documents. Their faces smiled from framed photographs on office walls. Elias listened as the journalist spoke. He felt the familiar pull to stay quiet, to let the moment pass. But the fear that once ruled him had changed. There was no family left to threaten, no future left to bargain with. Only the past remained, heavy and unfinished. You said before that some truths don't stay put, the journalist said carefully. I think this one never did. Elias stood without answering and walked to the back of the house. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as they always had. He knelt and pulled up a loose plank near the wall. Beneath it sat a small metal box, worn and dull, its edges rough with age. He had not opened it in decades. Inside were things he never meant to keep forever. A ledger page torn from the grain office records, showing shipments that never arrived. A signed order authorizing late-night access to storage buildings. A matchbook stamped with a company name, the same one Elias had seen near the fire that night. And beneath it all, a faded sketch he had drawn himself, marking where each man stood as the flames spread. Elias carried the box to the table and set it down between them. These men, Elias said, his voice steady but low. They didn't panic. They planned. The journalist did not touch the box right away. Why keep this? He asked. Why not destroy it? Elias looked at his hands. Because I needed to remember, he said. And because I knew one day I might need proof that I wasn't imagining things. Word spread quickly once the first document was shown. Questions returned to the town, sharper than before. Officials dismissed them at first, smiling the same polite smiles Elias remembered. They spoke of progress, of moving forward, of not reopening old wounds. But old wounds had never healed. They had only been covered. As pressure grew, Elias was called in again, this time to a larger office with cleaner walls. The men across from him were older, slower, but still confident. One of them leaned back in his chair and spoke with the same calm tone Elias remembered from years ago. You've lived a quiet life, the man said. You don't want to complicate it now. Elias met his eyes. It's already complicated, he replied. Another man sighed. People don't need this, he said. The town doesn't need it. The town deserved better, Elias said. That was the moment Elias understood how much power silence had given them, and how dangerous truth was now that it had a voice. The evidence was enough to force hearings, enough to crack the story everyone had accepted. It was not enough to promise justice. Too much time had passed. Too many records were missing. Too many people preferred comfort over accountability. Still, the truth stood in the open at last. As Elias left the building, reporters waited. Cameras flashed. Voices called his name. He did not stop to speak. He had already said everything that mattered. He walked slowly down the street, past the plaques and portraits, knowing that some would be removed and others quietly left in place. The men who had once watched a town burn now watched an old man walk away, their control weakened but not erased. Elias felt no triumph, only a deep, steady exhaustion. He had finally opened the box. The town could never fully close it again. The truth did not arrive like a storm. It moved slower than that, settling into the town in pieces. Newspaper columns, public meetings, conversations that stopped when someone else entered the room. People argued over details, over intent, over whether it was better to let the past rest. But no one could fully put the story back where it had been. Elias Crowley became known again, though not in the way people once knew him. Some called him brave, others called him foolish. A few said nothing at all but looked away when he passed. The town had learned the truth, but it had not agreed on what to do with it. The hearings ended without the clean ending many had expected. Too much time had passed. Records were incomplete. Responsibility was spread thin, diluted by years of silence and shared benefit. A few names were quietly removed from plaques. A few offices changed hands. But the men who had shaped the town still lived in fine houses, their influence reduced but not erased. Elias was never promised anything for speaking out. No protection, no reward. When it was over, he returned to his small house at the edge of town, the same one he had lived in for decades. The silence there felt different now. He had broken it, and it no longer protected him from his thoughts. At night, he slept poorly. Dreams came uninvited. He saw flames again, but they were slower, quieter, more patient. He woke with questions he could no longer push aside. Had he waited too long? Had his silence helped build the very power he later challenged? One afternoon, a letter arrived from Samuel. His son wrote carefully, as if choosing words that would not reopen old wounds. He said he had followed the news from afar. He said he understood now why Elias had been the way he was. He said he wished things had been different. There was forgiveness in the letter, but also distance. Years do not close easily, even when truth finally steps in. Elias folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. He felt relief, but it was mixed with regret so deep it settled into his bones. Speaking out had not restored what was lost. It had only clarified the shape of it. As time passed, fewer people came by. The journalist wrote his final piece and moved on. The town adjusted to its new version of history, one that included footnotes and uncomfortable facts. Life went on, because it always does. On a cool morning, Elias walked through the rebuilt streets one last time. He passed the places where homes had once stood, where laughter had once come easily. Children ran past him, unaware of the ground beneath their feet. He did not stop them. He did not warn them. Some knowledge has to be earned. He reached the old riverbank and sat down, watching the water move steadily forward. It had flowed through fire and silence alike, unchanged by either. Elias understood then that truth is not a cure. It does not fix what has been broken. It does not return the years or soften every consequence. Sometimes all it does is remove the excuse to keep pretending. He had lived most of his life choosing between fear and love, silence and safety. In the end, he chose to speak when there was little left to lose. That choice did not make him whole. It only made him honest. As the sun dipped low, Elias rose and turned back toward his house. Behind him, the town continued on, carrying both the lie it had lived with and the truth it now had to face. And somewhere between those two things stood the cost of silence, waiting patiently for the next person who would decide whether to carry it forward or finally set it down.